Wonderful. So here we go. We shall share the results of some formative research that we did with you to hear from you what your views are of responsive feedback mechanisms, how you're using them, if at all, how we can use them better. So this is really a presentation about you and what you have told us. So the definition of responsive feedback mechanism that we asked you about is it enables the real world effects of programming to become more transparent, more regularly, so that we can iterate and improve. So just a really simple back of a napkin sort of definition of what a responsive feedback mechanism is. Why did we do this research? It was to create engagement with you, our community of practice, to understand what you think about responsive feedback mechanisms now, what your knowledge is of them, what your opportunities are to use them, and also to try to understand the optimal conditions under which responsive feedback mechanisms can be used more. So we spoke to national organizations, international donors. We also spoke to early adopters who are organizations of any of those three types who are successfully using responsive feedback mechanisms now. Thank you.
Am I not loud enough? I thought I was. Okay. Okay, fair enough. Thank you. So, executive summary, there's certainly widespread enthusiasm for responsive feedback mechanisms. The people we spoke to certainly saw the value in them in helping them to get better faster. So there's certainly buy-in to them, which is wonderful. There's, of course, loads of work going on across the sector already. It goes under lots of different names: real-time monitoring, optimization, adaptive management. This is not an idea that was born yesterday, certainly, and there's loads of work across the sector that goes under many, many names. So some issues were identified through talking to you that we would love this community of practice to address in this forum. One is, how can we create a culture in which iteration is a habit and changing course is seen as a success? How can we, oh goodness, this has come up already, how can we articulate acceptable standards of evidence for responsive feedback mechanisms? I love the energetic conversation of a few moments ago, and a couple of clear points came out of that for me. One is, don't set up a false dichotomy between randomized controlled trials on one hand and then loosey-goosey rapid feedback on the other. Rapid feedback can be a randomized controlled trial. I know we had a mention from this side of the room that you're running hundreds of what are technically randomized controlled trials. Digital A/B testing, for one example, is a randomized controlled trial. So let's avoid a false dichotomy between the two. And as Vish said, use the right method at the right time. As Vish said, I wouldn't want to take a drug that hadn't been through a randomized controlled trial. There is and will always be a role for randomized controlled trials as the scientific gold standard when you need proof. But there also might be a role for just pointers that are not yet proven. For example, the colorblind nurse who said, I can't tell the color difference between a do not resuscitate colored bracelet and a peanut allergy bracelet. That's an anecdotal case of one. That can be a pointer that we can try to act on. It's not proof, it's just a pointer. So maybe we should discuss that further. What's the role for just some pointers? What's the role for proof? But there's a very big discussion to be had there, which we've only just begun. Certainly welcome direction from the feedback in the room, and hopefully we can, as a community, come to some conclusions. How can donors encourage continuous iteration? Absolutely. Lots of you told us that. There were lots of comments about how the structure of relationships with donors could be evolved, perhaps. So that's another huge topic about how donors can encourage continuous iteration through responsive feedback mechanisms. And finally, how can we disseminate best practice in creating and acting on responsive feedback? Certainly lots of room for sharing knowledge on how to gather data well, how to analyze data well, how to act on the findings in the face of organizational inertia and sometimes siloed teams. And already this morning we've heard lots of lovely ideas about that. So what you told us is that there are varying interpretations of what constitutes a responsive feedback mechanism. Personally, I don't see this as a bad thing at all. There's no such thing as unwelcome feedback, and responsive feedback can be a very broad church. So you told us you were using lots of types of methods to collect data, from direct data surveys to digital A/B testing, for example, which is a bit more unobtrusive. You were getting responsive feedback at all sorts of project stages and so on. So lots of variety, which is a very positive story, I think. So one of the main findings, there's strong buy-in to responsive feedback mechanisms, and that was very clear. One of the donors put it beautifully: we need relentless incrementalism. Every day you get a little bit better than the day before. Lovely way to put it. We heard from you that you value being able to self-correct early on, ahead of when things have been set in stone, so being able to tweak and pivot when the clay is still soft. Another lovely expression from a donor: RFMs are critical because our goal is not making a grant but solving a problem. And what a lovely way to put the need to iterate. Some howevers: skepticism about standards of evidence, which is clearly a large and thorny and fascinating topic, and also substantial barriers to implementation. So 5 types of barriers that we will discuss. So responsive feedback mechanisms are seen to have pros and cons against traditional M&E. People told us that they think responsive feedback mechanisms reveal the performance of activities faster and more regularly. They enable quick pivots. However, there was skepticism that RFMs can produce evidence that meets existing standards for justifying changes to programming. So that's something we welcome figuring out, or trying to figure out as a community. When do you just need a pointer? When do you need proof? How much evidence is enough in order to make changes to programming? So a big open question. There were 5 perceived barriers to implementing responsive feedback mechanisms. Cultural ones, norms, habits, practices. I mean, we all work in behavior change, so we know how important norms are, and sometimes norms are not our friend. Structural barriers, so how organizations are set up. Capability barriers, especially in terms of technical and data analysis. Resource barriers: time and money are never infinite. And contextual barriers, which are just local realities that can hinder getting our hands on feedback and being able to apply it. So first, cultural barriers. Sometimes organizations can lack a strong culture of responsive feedback. It's just not a habit, it's just not a mindset. So therefore, it's just not something that happens very frequently. We're all human, so there can be a reluctance to think that things aren't working very well and we should change course. There's naturally a bit of inertia in systems. Again, that's only natural and only human. And there can be different norms and practices within teams. Lots of you told us that research and evaluation naturally is focused and perfectly justifiably is focused on scientific rigor because that's their job. Project implementers, on the other hand, may be a little bit more open to untested ideas, so there can be some different norms between those two teams. So your words, it's really hard for organizations to be honest that something may not be working. It'd be wonderful if this work flipped that dialogue into saying that if something's not working, that actually is useful information, and changing course is viewed as success, not failure. So, lovely expression. People also spoke about the different levels of rigor between academics and implementers. It can almost be 2 different languages, and bridging that gap can be tricky, and we welcome your insight in how we can do that. Structural barriers, you told us that the donor-grantee relationship may lack the incentives, the frequent communication, and grant flexibility to naturally accommodate responsive feedback mechanisms. Not that it's impossible by any means, but there were comments around, should that be an open topic? Could it be tailored in some way to be more open to that? You mentioned regulatory barriers. And you mentioned diffusion of responsibility, because the many successful cases of responsive feedback that we heard of involved many different teams. So there might be the team on the ground who's gathering the data, the data analysis team, the M&E team who pull the learnings out of that data, maybe the digital content team who makes changes to content on the back of those learnings, and then back around to feedback. So lots of different teams are usually involved in these kinds of partnerships. But what that can mean is that there's a diffusion of responsibility and a lack of ownership, and it's just hard, if I'm honest, to organize that many stakeholders. So it can be tricky when you have that many teams involved. It can be tricky to change existing programs, you told us. Few things exist in isolation, and when you pull one thread and start changing one thing, sometimes the whole shirt can unravel. So it can be tricky to make changes, which is fair enough. Oh, hello. And siloed data as well, because often data lives in many different places. There can be one database over here, a pot of qual data over here, and it can be quite difficult to bring those things together. So this is what you told us are some of the structural barriers. In your words, an early adopter said, the way donor contracts are designed, you set your measurable deliverables up front and you're kind of closed into doing that. Insightful feedback can relate to lots of different teams, to the UX team, design, content. It's cross-functional in the sense that it can involve any team, which is where the diffusion of responsibility and challenges coordinating can come in. An early adopter said, we don't work with just one ministry or one agency. Other agencies are always present, and even within one agency, there might not be good data sharing necessarily. So a perennial problem for anyone who deals with data ever. There can be capability barriers. We've seen that understanding of responsive feedback mechanisms can differ across our community of practice. There can be a lack of consensus on what they are, why you use them, how you use them. I think there's certainly buy-in to the broad idea, but responsive feedback mechanism is one of so many terms of real-time monitoring and adaptive management, and so there was a bit of a lack of consensus around what is that specifically. As we've seen, this will rear its head again, a lack of consensus about acceptable standards of evidence for RFMs. And also the expert knowledge and technical ability can be lacking, so hardcore data analysis, data visualization, those skills in particular you told us can be lacking. So an early adopter said organizations are set up to deliver, not necessarily to create responsive feedback. There's less understanding of what that means and the appropriate level of rigor. Next are resource barriers. Time and money are never infinite, and responsive feedback mechanisms are particularly unlikely to happen when they are seen as an extra burden. So it's something else that I have to fit into my 9 to 5 or my 8 to 8, as it is for many people. When responsive feedback mechanisms are seen as an extra spend and something else I have to cram into my budget, I'm already paying for M&E, for goodness sake, I have to do this as well, then whenever it seems like an extra burden on time and money, they're particularly unlikely to happen. So a national organization said, the feedback mechanisms that have been developed here are expensive, making them difficult to sustain. The best feedback mechanism works when it's part of the system, when it's part of the job that I'm doing and makes my life easier. Only then can we create the proper buy-in. So that's a lovely quote in that it has both problem and solution. When responsive feedback mechanisms are seen as an extra burden, they're unlikely to happen. When they're a natural and integrated part of your job anyway, then they are more likely to happen. And lastly, contextual barriers. So lots of local things that can inhibit getting feedback. Access barriers. It can be hard to get to respondents, particularly the most vulnerable or rural respondents. It can be hard to get out to see local conditions on the ground, and as we've seen, there's no substitute for getting out there. You'll answer questions you hadn't even thought to ask when you actually go out into the field, and sometimes that's hard. Technology for data collection can be lacking. Behavioral barriers, the target audience doesn't really want to give us feedback, don't know why we want it, and there's no easy method for giving it. Cultural barriers, not least politeness. People can be reluctant to hurt your feelings or tell you that things aren't working. So that's a tricky one as well. I know that one of our interviewees told us that she found a clever way around that. Instead of asking for feedback, she asked for suggestions, and just that little semantic change made people more comfortable offering criticism. An early adopter said, a lot of the countries we work with don't have robust data collection points, or the technology is just not there to collect the data, and that's something we've heard again and again. One barrier is, for example, when you ask people for feedback, they will quite often just try and say what you want to hear. Another barrier is just getting to people. They have busy lives and priorities, and that priority is not to be giving feedback. So we just need to make it easier for them to do and give them a motive to do it. So all types of organizations had encountered challenges with responsive feedback. Nationals told us they'd certainly had firsthand experience with the local realities, the local difficulties of getting your hands on feedback and getting your hands on reliable data that can tell you how you're doing. They were found especially unappetizing, any situation in which they had to add extra spend or try to retrofit a responsive feedback to an existing program, and they certainly welcomed more technical support on evaluating feedback. One said, we certainly need some technical support and assistance with designing the baseline, with assessing the impact, with evaluating, so certainly much M&E and real professional technical analysis help was welcomed. Internationals generally had greater exposure to projects incorporating responsive feedback, often greater technical expertise, but it's not a cakewalk for anyone. They still had concerns about the quality of data, how do you get data at scale at a reasonable cost. One very clever thing that one international organization mentioned to us was using a theory of change as a tool. So using a theory of change is an exercise to expose your assumptions and to map your assumed causal links and to try to find places that you could experiment. So it's a lovely mental exercise, I suppose, to expose assumptions and possibly spot places that you could test your assumptions and find ways to improve. One of the internationals told us, how do you get enough handsets into the hands of folks on a large-scale program so you can collect data regularly, and especially if they're, by definition, working internationally, how do you afford that at scale? And then we had a mention of internationals that they were working with a local partner to try to help them develop a theory of change, because that's a lovely way to try to have ideas for how things might be improved and how assumptions might be tested. Donors had lots of enthusiasm for the potential of RFMs. They did question that their view was that there are greater incentives sometimes to do randomized controlled trials rather than responsive feedback. So how can we help to change that incentive system? There were some questions about grantee capacity and capability, particularly with M&E. Donors recognize that if grantees are to be genuinely iterative, it will take a lot more of the donor's time and the grantee's time. They'll need a much closer working relationship and much more frequent communication if they really want to build in responsive feedback. One donor said, we often assume that people just want to do the right thing or the rational thing or want to move faster or make better decisions tomorrow than they did yesterday. But while the incentives to do RCTs are very clear, the incentives to do this work are not really that apparent to me. A donor said, you want to be able to let your grantee go, give them space and time to be able to implement. However, RFMs require constant engagement and constant communication. You need to almost be fully engaged with the grantee. Early adopters are doing this successfully. They're building responsive feedback mechanisms. They're overcoming those silos. We heard lovely stories about getting different teams working together across the organization, implementers, M&E, everyone working together. They were applying data analysis tools and dashboards and data visualization, also using ethnographic and qualitative methods in many cases, visiting communities, opening community dialogues, getting out in the field. However, there are still lots of challenges in interpreting data, prioritizing learnings. Sometimes there were too many. Sometimes there was a a broken fire hydrant's worth of learnings coming at them, and they didn't know how to prioritize them and which ones to act on first. An early adopter said, we might be great at gathering information, but then what do we do with these insights? You can't implement every single piece of feedback, so how do you prioritize? And the toolkit that we'll be sharing tomorrow has one suggested tool for trying to prioritize which learnings to act on first. And I'm sure in this room there are lots of ideas and lots of ways of practical tools for doing that. So finally, last few slides, we'll end with how to map conditions for effective implementation. So how do we get this right? What are the learnings? So this is the 4-part map that you've seen before: listen, interpret, react, possibly act instead, and monitor. So in terms of listening, we've heard it can be hard to get reliable feedback at scale. So some learnings there is that within this CURB initiative, we could disseminate best practice for getting that reliable data and turning it into something I can act on, taking that database, which is full of columns and rows, and I don't know quite what to do with it, and turning it into concise, actionable insight. Let's ensure that evaluators go into the field to listen, and no substitute for being there. And we heard lots of lovely stories about getting out in the field and the lovely insights that come out of that. Being open to anecdotal data, and thinking from the start about how data could be turned into actionable insight. So listening with intent, and starting with a question in mind before you go to your data. And finally, that lovely tool of the theory of change, which can be an excellent one for revealing assumptions and areas for testing. An early adopter said the problems are in the front end and the back end, deciding what information to gather and having the capacity to say, if we get this data, what will we do with it? So the suggestion isn't that you never collect data in an open-ended way without knowing what questions you'll use it to answer. People certainly told us that it was valuable to think ahead of time, and to listen with intent, and to think ahead of time about what questions that data might answer. With interpreting, currently there are a range of tools used for that, and the learnings are that we certainly need to articulate acceptable standards of evidence, and also develop systems for prioritizing which insights to act on, because with many folks it is the broken fire hydrant. An early adopter said, this is a challenge I've seen across several organizations where you gather all these insights, you put them in a spreadsheet or report, and where do they go from there, apart from into a file folder, perhaps. And finally, reacting, many issues that we've seen before. Some learnings are to create an environment in which changing course is seen as a success. Make sure implementers feel a sense of ownership, because in the end, they're the ones who will need to make the changes. So make sure they feel involved and a sense of ownership. And we also heard comments about evolving donor processes to more readily accommodate RFMs. Comment from an early adopter, we bring partners in early and make sure they feel ownership for the solution. That sense of ownership is so important for getting things to change. I heard a lovely story as well about a very happy relationship with a donor, that the donor was hugely supportive of adaptive learning. And this organization would contact the donor and be very frank and say things aren't working, and the donor said, fine, let's figure out how to do it differently. So that sounded like a happy situation. And with monitoring, we certainly need to articulate acceptable standards of evidence for RFMs. And I was struck that that topic came up in our first 17 minutes together because it's one that's hard to avoid. And hopefully we can crack that together. So this is our last quote. A donor said, the bar isn't necessarily causality, but contribution. If you can be clear about your outcome measure, for example, you want 10,000 users of family planning and you launch your iterative effort and you get to 10,000, then you have a decent way to talk about the contribution to get to 10,000 without saying we exclusively caused it. So does that line maybe help us toward an acceptable standard of evidence, that the bar isn't necessarily causality, but contribution? Is it articulating different roles for pointers and proof? Let's discuss. So in summary, lots of enthusiasm, lots going on, and lots to address. So I think we have no shortage of an agenda for the curve.